Hello everyone, and welcome to the Scrum Master Introduction course. In this course, we will cover the core topics to help you master the foundation of a Scrum Master, and also provide you with the knowledge you need to have before pursuing any Scrum Master certifications. By knowing the topics covered in this class, you'll be much better prepared and ahead of everyone else when starting your Scrum Master journey. Let's get started. Welcome to the Agile Shop. In this video, we will cover the Agile Manifesto and the Agile Principles. The Agile Manifesto is a statement of Agile values and principles that summarizes the thinking of the Agile perspective and methodologies. A group of 17 people from the industry met in 2001 and collaborated on creating what today is known as the 4 Agile values and the 12 Agile principles. Let's first look at the 4 values of the Agile Manifesto. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. While processes and tools will be necessary on our project, we should focus more on individuals and interactions involved. Valuing people more highly than processes or tools is easy to understand because it is the people who respond to business needs and drive the development process. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Historically, using the waterfall methodology, enormous amounts of time were spent on documenting the product for development and ultimate delivery. This value reminds us to focus on working software that provides business and user value, rather than on paperwork or heavy documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. We want to seek a collaborative solution to issues that might arise during the product development, rather than to stick to a rigid contract. Responding to change over following a plan. Needs and requirements are always shifting, and priorities are always changing. That's why the Agile Manifesto suggests that a software team should have the ability to pivot and change directions whenever needed, and embrace a flexible roadmap versus a locked-in plan. Now let's review the 12 Agile principles. Customer satisfaction. Provide customer satisfaction by early and continuous delivery of valuable products. Requirements change. Welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Deliver working software frequently. Working features are delivered frequently in weeks, rather than months. Business and IT collaboration. Close daily cooperation between business people and IT developers. Trust and empowerment. Build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. Face-to-face. Face-to-face conversations are the most efficient and effective ways to communicate. Working features. Working features are the principal measure of progress. Sustainable. Sustainable development and able to maintain a constant pace. Good design. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Simplicity. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. Self-organizing. Best architecture requirements and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. Continuous improvement. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective and adjusts. This concludes our 12 Agile principles and 4 Agile values. In this video, we'll talk about empirical versus defined processes. Scrum is founded on empiricism. Empiricism asserts that knowledge comes from experience and making decisions based on what is observed. For example, in Agile software development, the empirical process works by dividing work into workable bits. After each small workable chunk is completed, the team shows the work as is to the rest of the organization. Based on their inspection and observations after each delivery, the team can adjust and make any necessary changes. In contrast, with a defined process, each step is known upfront and can be documented and implemented end-to-end. For example, in the fast food business, making a burger has a predefined set of steps, which makes it easy for each new employee to learn the process and make a burger based on the instructions provided. To implement an empirical process in practice, we need to have 3 pillars of empiricism, which are transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Empirical process is built on the idea of inspecting and adapting instead of a step-by-step defined process. Since the external environment is continuously changing, empirical processes help you to remain flexible and adjust in any complex system. It allows us to gain knowledge by means of direct and indirect observations or experience. Empirical process is very helpful in software development, where the nature of product is mostly impacted by the uncertainty and shifts in technology. Scrum is built on transparency. We want to show our work early and often and be transparent in the process in order to inspect and adapt. In this video, we'll talk about the 5 Scrum values. Successful Scrum depends on the entire team living up to the Scrum values: commitment, focus, openness, respect, and courage. The 5 Scrum values are simple, living them is not. Following the 5 Scrum values usually requires changing a lot of ways of how we work. Let's take a look at each Scrum value. Commitment. The Scrum team commits to achieving its goals and supporting each other. Each person commits to the rest of the team. The Scrum team works together as a unit. They trust each other to follow through on what they say they are going to do. The team is empowered to pick the work they believe they can complete. This way they minimize overcommitting to work. Focus. Their primary focus is on the work of the sprint to make the best possible progress towards their goals. The goal should support the product creation that provides the highest value to the user or customers. One way to stay focused is by eliminating or reducing competing priorities and minimizing distractions. The Scrum Master has a key role in protecting the team from distractions or anything else that takes the Scrum team's attention away from the main goal. Openness. In Scrum, we are encouraged to be open to new ideas and the ideas of others. We want all team members to participate in trying new things and the introduction of innovating ideas. The Scrum team and stakeholders should be open about all the work and transparent of any challenges they might be having when performing the work. Respect. Scrum team members respect each other to be capable, independent people and are respected as such by the people with who they work. They respect each other's ideas and opinions. Scrum team members argue respectfully even if they disagree. Courage. Scrum values the courage of each individual contributor to the team. The Scrum team members have the courage to do the right thing and to work on tough problems. Each Scrum team member has the courage to look at new ideas and look at things from a new perspective. The Scrum Master and Product Owner should foster courage and allow the team to fail from which they can learn new things. That wraps our quick summary for the 5 Scrum values. In this video, we will answer what is Scrum. Scrum is an agile framework for developing innovative products and services by using an incremental and iterative approach. It is not a standardized process where you methodically follow a series of sequential steps, but rather a framework for organizing and managing work based on a set of values. Scrum is built on transparency, inspection, and adaptation. The Scrum team is composed of a small team of people. Within that team, we have a product owner, a Scrum Master, and a development team. The team is self-managing with no sub-teams or hierarchies. The product owner is one team member that represents the voice of the customer. The product owner is responsible for maximizing the value of the product. They own the product backlog, which is a list of what is needed to build or to improve the product. The product owner is constantly prioritizing and keeping the items up to date into the product backlog. The Scrum Master is a leader who serves the Scrum team. They are responsible for making sure the team executes using the Scrum framework. They provide any coaching or help with the Scrum theory and practice. They help the team stay focused on the goal and the active work. They remove any impediments the team might have that stands in their way in achieving that goal. They also capture the team metrics and ensure that all Scrum events take place in a time box. The development team are the people that are building the product. In the world of digital products, the development team could be composed of designers, software developers, data engineers, quality assurance engineers, and anyone else that's needed to build a digital product. The team should have all the skills necessary to create value each sprint. These roles covered have a lot more responsibilities and duties that were covered in this short video. If you want to learn more, please subscribe to our channel. Let's talk about the Scrum workflow. Each digital product starts with a vision and ultimately is transformed into a set of features and user stories that live in a product backlog. The Scrum workflow starts with a product backlog, which usually has more work than the team can handle in one iteration, which is why the product backlog is prioritized by the product owner with what is the most important to the customer and the stakeholders. The items are refined with the development team and prepared for the sprint. During the sprint planning, the product owner and development team agree on a sprint goal that defines what the upcoming sprint is supposed to achieve. Using this goal, the development team reviews the product backlog and determines the high priority items that the team can realistically accomplish in that upcoming sprint. The user stories that are refined and brought into a sprint planning create what is called the sprint backlog. This will be the focus for the development team during the active sprint. Most teams work within sprints of 2 weeks to a month in duration. Once the sprint starts, each day of the sprint, ideally at the same time, the Scrum team holds a 15-minute time-box Scrum event called the Daily Scrum. The purpose of the Daily Scrum is to inspect progress towards the sprint goal and adapt the sprint backlog as necessary, adjusting the upcoming planned work. At the end of the sprint, the Scrum team and the stakeholders review what was accomplished in the sprint during a Scrum event called the Sprint Review. The goal of this activity is to inspect and adapt the product that is being built and make any necessary changes to the product backlog. A successful sprint review results in bidirectional information flow between the Scrum team and the stakeholders. The stakeholders, they get to learn more about the development effort, and the Scrum team learns more about the business and the product vision. The last Scrum event at the end of the sprint is the sprint retrospective. This is a session where the internal Scrum team inspects how the last sprint went with regards to the individuals, the interactions, the processes, tools, and their definition of done. The purpose of the sprint retrospective is to plan ways to increase quality and effectiveness. This session is usually facilitated by the Scrum Master. Once the retrospective ends, the entire process repeats. In this video, we will cover the top 10 things an Agile team should expect from the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master is the servant leader and the glue of the Agile team. The Scrum team expects the Scrum Master to support and serve the team, which is why it's common for the Scrum Master to be described as a servant leader. This means the main focus of the Scrum Master is to make sure the team needs are being met. A key distinction of the servant leader is to not be misunderstood as a team manager. The team does not work or report to the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master helps everyone understand and embrace the Scrum values, principles, and practices. They own the Scrum process, and the team looks up to them for any advice, best practices, or guidance on how to work within the Scrum framework. The Scrum team expects the Scrum Master to be their dedicated Agile coach. When the Scrum team encounters challenges and problems, the Scrum Master will try to steer the team to find their own solutions first. In the case the team is not able to do that, the Scrum Master will take ownership and help find a resolution. When any confusion arises from the Scrum team on roles and responsibilities, or any questions come up in this area, they look up to the Scrum Master for clarification. So the Scrum Master should explain the Scrum activities and the duties and be knowledgeable to provide examples if needed, especially to any new Scrum team members. Another expectation for the Scrum Master is to protect the development team from any outside interference, so they can remain focused on delivering the business value every sprint. Interferences usually come from stakeholders and managers in the form of a new request. Sometimes they can come from other teams as well. If the requests are not being intercepted by the Scrum Master, they could redirect the team members in the middle of the active sprint. When the team runs into any impediments or blockers for the user stories they are currently working on during the active sprint, the team expects the Scrum Master to just jump in and remove those blockers. The Scrum Master will either directly remove those impediments or escalate the work with the higher management to get them removed and minimize downtime. The best Agile teams will always want to measure and improve their own performance every sprint. The team expects the Scrum Master to capture the team metrics and provide visibility to the Scrum team of their performance. The Scrum Master will create the dashboards to capture these metrics and teach the team how they should interpret these metrics. The Scrum Master is expected to continuously improve the team process and always try to elevate the team to a higher standard of delivery. Using a data-driven approach, is one of the best ways to identify process improvement opportunities. The Scrum Master also observes the team during the entire sprint cycle. They collect data and stakeholders' feedback, and in partnership with the Scrum team, they create action items of improvement every sprint. If you want to learn more details on metrics or process improvement, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our new videos. Always aiming to raise the bar and improve the team every sprint requires a lot of change. Sometimes the changes required to be successful with Scrum can be difficult. Not everyone in the Scrum team might be comfortable with so many changes. The Scrum Master helps the team understand the need for change and helps the team navigate through any big changes. You might not hear this point directly from a team or find it part of any official responsibility, but having a positive attitude and motivating the team at all times is how the best Scrum Masters stand out. Thank you for watching our video on the top 10 things an Agile team should expect from the Scrum Master. In this video, we will cover the top 10 things an Agile team should expect from the product owner. The product owner should be the most knowledgeable person of the product vision. They should communicate this vision to the team. The product owner should know what the problems of the product will solve, who the audience is, and the overall benefit of this product. The product owner will collaborate with the stakeholders and users of the product to understand the product requirements. The product owner will transform these requirements into user stories. In the digital world, a user story is a short description of functionality for a digital product from an end user perspective. These user stories will form the product backlog. The development team and the stakeholders expect the product owner to make the product backlog visible, transparent, and clear. The product owner works with the development team to refine the user stories and make sure the team fully understands each user stories. The team expects the product owner to own the product backlog and keep it prioritized at all times. The team expects that any incoming requests for the product enhancements or fixes from stakeholders or other teams will go directly to the product owner, so they can be transformed into user stories. During the sprint planning, which initiates the sprint, the team expects the product owner to bring the highest priority user stories and the desired sprint goal. After the sprint planning is complete, and the development team commits to the work that can be achieved during the sprint based on their capacity, the product owner should communicate the committed sprint goal to all stakeholders. During the active sprint, the development team expects the product owner to be available to provide any clarifications that might be needed for the active user stories. At the end of the sprint, the product owner invites the stakeholders to the sprint review. During this session, the product owner with the development team discusses the outcome of the sprint. Based on the lessons learned from the sprint and the feedback received from the stakeholders, revisions are made to the product backlog. Stakeholders expect the product owner to communicate at all times the sprint status and any product functionality that has been released. Once any completed work is deployed and live, the product owner communicates the product releases. In this video, we will cover the top 5 things to expect from the development team in Scrum. The development team should be composed of all the skills necessary to deliver the business value. The team must deliver a vertical slice of the product functionality each sprint. That means those roles must be able to design, develop, integrate, test, and deploy a slice of that functionality. The development team is expected to collaborate with the product owner and refine the user stories from the product backlog. This includes refining user stories by clarifying the details, adding any additional technical information required, and estimating those user stories. The development team is expected to attend the sprint planning with the rest of the team. During this session, they collaborate with the product owner to establish the sprint goal. Based on their capacity, the team loads a subset of the user stories from the product backlog that are needed to achieve the sprint goal. The development team is expected to self-organize and execute the work they committed during the sprint planning. During the active sprint, the entire team meets to inspect and adapt during a daily stand-up. During this session, the development team inspects progress during the sprint goal and adapts the plan if needed. They should also communicate any blockers or impediments to the Scrum Master. At the end of the sprint, the development team is expected to join the sprint review in which they go over the work completed. Usually, the development team would demo any features completed to the stakeholders. After this session, the internal Scrum team will inspect and adapt their process and performance during the sprint retrospective meeting. During this session, the development team is expected to participate and discuss openly what they can change to optimize or improve their technical practices or Scrum processes. Thank you for watching our video. In this video, we'll answer what is sprint planning in Scrum. The sprint planning meeting kicks off the sprint. A product backlog may represent many months of work, which is more than the Scrum team can complete in a single sprint. To determine the most important subset of product backlog items to build in the next sprint, the team holds the sprint planning. The roles that join the sprint planning meeting are the product owner, Scrum Master, and the development team. During the sprint planning, the product owner and the development team agree on the sprint goal, which is what the sprint should achieve. With this sprint goal in mind, the product owner and the team picks the highest priority product backlog items that can be completed within the sprint, while working at a sustainable pace. The backlog items should be in a format of a user story, which includes an acceptance criteria. The creation of the user story is the main responsibility of the product owner. The user stories should be estimated by the development team in story points. If you want to know more how user stories should be structured with acceptance criteria or what are story points, please watch our other videos here. The collection of user stories that are picked from the product backlog to go into the next sprint forms the sprint backlog. Usually, the product owner would explain one story at a time to the development team. The entire team will have a conversation to make sure everyone on the team understands the user stories. After the user story is understood, the development team will drive the conversation on how this user story will be achieved. At the end of this conversation, the development team will estimate the user story in story points and introduce the user story in the sprint backlog. This process repeats until the development team has enough user stories to fill a sprint backlog, and no more that they can complete within the sprint while working at a sustainable pace. The sprint allocation of user story doesn't need to be perfect, but the development team will get better in time with planning how many user stories they should commit in the sprint planning. The duration of the sprint planning meeting depends on the length of the sprint. If the team performs within a 2-week sprint, the sprint planning meeting should be anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. The more mature the Scrum team is, the more efficient and short the sprint planning usually is. The sprint planning meeting is usually scheduled on Monday or midweek. If you want to know when you should schedule your sprint planning and all the other Scrum ceremonies, you should watch our other videos here. This ends our video on what is sprint planning in Scrum. In this video, we will explain the daily Scrum, and make sure to watch until the end for a bonus tip that you can use during the daily Scrum. Daily Scrum is a short daily update meeting held by the development team. The purpose of the daily Scrum, also known as stand-up, is to inspect progress towards the sprint goal and adapt the sprint backlog as necessary, adjusting the upcoming planned work. This meeting is usually done in the beginning of the day, so we can set the plan for the rest of the day. The roles that participate in the daily Scrum are the development team as the main group, and the Scrum Master and Product Owner as observers. Besides keeping everyone focused on the sprint goal, the stand-up provides an early way to spot any risk or identify things that can derail the team progress. When the team members know what everyone else is doing, it helps them coordinate their efforts and keep the work flowing smoothly. During these quick meetings, the Scrum Master is informed of any blockers or impediments and takes action towards resolving them for the team. The most common format for the daily Scrum is where each team member takes turns to briefly answer 3 questions. What have you worked on since the last meeting? What do you plan to finish today? Are there any problems or impediments to your progress? It's a best practice for the meeting to be 15-minute long and occur at the same time every day. This means each team member's answer has to be brief. Let's go over the bonus tip mentioned at the beginning of the video. The development team and the Scrum Master have found it very valuable to use a visual board that shows the sprint backlog items during the daily Scrum. The visual board can be either an actual physical whiteboard or a digital board like Jira. This is beneficial because the entire team can highlight the user stories discussed by each team member as they take turns and even filter by each team member in tools like Jira. If you are facilitating or attending daily scrums without a visual board, we encourage you to give it a try for a sprint and get your team's feedback at the end of the sprint. This ends our video on the daily scrum. Welcome to the Agile Shop. In this video, we'll answer, what is sprint review in Agile? By the end of this video, we will provide you with a typical format of the sprint review. In Scrum, the sprint review is a meeting at the end of the sprint in which the team provides an overview of the work completed. The goal of the sprint review is to inspect the outcome of the sprint and determine future adaptations. The conversation that takes place between the Scrum Master, product owner, and stakeholders and any other interesting member of the team is critical to this activity. The conversation is focused on the completed features by the development team. Everyone gets a clear visibility into the work that is being done by the Scrum team, and attendees can collaborate on what to do next. The product backlog may also be adjusted to meet these new opportunities. A successful review results in a bidirectional information flow between the Scrum team and the stakeholders. The sprint review is a working session, and the Scrum team should avoid limiting it to just a presentation. The stakeholders and the business people get to see the latest achievements by the development team. At the same time, the Scrum team gets a better understanding of what is important to the business and any changes in direction that might be needed for the product. The sprint review, therefore, represents a scheduled opportunity to inspect and adapt the product. The sprint review should be done at the end of the sprint, right before the sprint retrospective. We will discuss the sprint retrospective in a separate video, so make sure you subscribe to our channel to get notified when the video is released. A typical format of the sprint review meeting starts with the Scrum team providing an overview of the sprint goal they committed at the beginning of the sprint. This is followed by a status update on what was completed, and in the case of some things were not completed, the team discusses impediments they encountered. After this conversation, the team proceeds with demos of the work completed. It is recommended the only work that is fully complete is presented during the live demos. At the end of the demo, the Scrum team opens up the conversation for feedback. During this conversation, the product backlog might be adjusted. The meeting ends with a high-level overview of the top priorities in the product backlog. Keep in mind, this is just one example of the sprint review format. This ends our video of the sprint review. In this video, we'll answer, what is sprint retrospective in Agile? By the end of this video, we will also discuss two popular ways of running a sprint retrospective session. The purpose of the sprint retrospective is to plan ways to increase quality and effectiveness. The sprint retrospective is an opportunity to inspect and adapt the process. The Scrum team inspects how the last sprint went with regards to individuals, interactions, processes, tools, and their definition of done. The Scrum team discusses what went well during the sprint, what problems it encountered, and how those problems were solved or not solved. Let's look at the occurrence and timing of the sprint retrospective. This activity frequently occurs after the sprint review and before the next sprint planning. The sprint retrospective concludes the sprint, and it's usually a time-boxed 1 or 2 hour session depending on the sprint length. The participants of the sprint retrospective are the product owner, Scrum Master, and the development team. This discussion is usually internal without stakeholders or other outside teams. There are a lot of formats and ways of running a sprint retrospective. Usually teams start the session by looking at their sprint metrics and any other team metrics that informs the team performance. After the review and discussion of their performance, the team will use one of the many formats out there for the sprint retrospective. We will provide a quick overview of two of those many formats. One of them is the 3-column, the start, stop, and continue format. The start, stop, continue template is oriented around action and encourages team members to collaborate and come up with ideas for the team improvement. This approach is a simple and useful framework that helps individuals overcome some of the challenges of both giving and receiving feedback. The second format is having the 4 quadrants where the team enters sticky notes for each section. What was good? what was bad, ideas, and actions. By the end of this session, the team has a list of ideas on how to improve things. The ideas get transformed into improvement actions for the entire team. Thank you for watching. In this video, we'll answer what is a definition of done in Agile, and we'll provide you with a common example of a definition of done used in software development. The definition of done is an essential Agile concept that establishes a shared vision between the development team and the customer or product owner. The definition of done is when all conditions or acceptance criteria that a digital product must satisfy are met and ready to be accepted by a user, customer, or team. The definition is defined before the work starts so that everyone has the same understanding of what would be included as part of the completed work. Without a shared definition of done, there is a high potential for misunderstanding. For example, let's say the product owner or customer is asking for a developer how long it will take for a specific functionality to be complete. The developer's answer might be 5 days. The customer or product owner expects the functionality to be completed and available to be used in 1 week. In reality, the 5 days only includes the developer's build time and not the entire testing and deployment of the functionality, which in total comes down to 2 weeks. As you would expect, the customer will not be happy to find out the functionality is not done in 5 days, and it will take twice as long for the functionality to be fully complete. This scenario can be avoided by creating a definition of done. The definition of done is a checklist of the type of work the team is expected to successfully complete before it can be considered fully complete. Let's look at an example of a definition of done that is common in software development. The criteria of definition of done could be something like this. Design is reviewed, code is complete, and the development team can add additional sub-items under the code complete, end user documentation is updated, tested, and here we could have additional testing sub-items like unit testing, integration testing, and regression testing. There's 0 known defects, it's accepted tested, and deployed to a production environment. Keep in mind this is just an example and each Agile team will create their own version of the definition of done. Each team's definition of done will be different. There are a lot of factors that can change the definition of done. The type of product being built, the type of technology, or the type of organization. The minimum definition of done should deliver a slice of product functionality that includes design, built, integrated, tested, documented, and provides validated customer value. Keep in mind the definition of done evolves over time, and the team should review their definition of done to see if any improvements should be made. This brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for watching. In this video, we will cover how to write good user stories in Agile with acceptance criteria. At the end of this video, we will show you how to verify if you wrote a good user story, so stick with us until the end. When a product is created, the Agile teams typically break down the product features and requirements into user stories. User stories describe the desired functionality from the perspective of the user. Each user story should cover a small chunk of functionality and deliver value on its own. The user story description should be brief enough that it can be written on an index card. It needs to be written in a simple way so it can be understood by everyone, without including the solution or heavy technical information. Let's look at an example. As a Spotify podcast listener, I want to save podcasts as my favorites so that I can create my own custom list of favorite podcasts. This user story format is useful because it answers who the user role or persona is. In our example, is the Spotify podcast listener. It shows what the action of the user is, to save podcasts as favorites, and it highlights the value and answers the why, so that I can create my own custom list of favorite podcasts. After we write our user story, we need to start thinking about the criteria that informs us and the team when the user story is complete. This is called the acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria can be written in multiple formats. One of the formats that can be used for acceptance criteria is the given, when, then format. Let's use our user story as an example. Given the Spotify app displays podcasts, when I click the favorite icon that is displayed by each individual podcast, then the podcast gets saved and is displayed in my favorite list. As you notice, given shows context or precondition, when shows the action that is carried out, and then displays the observable outcome and expected results. As you can see, user stories with acceptance criteria are both simple concepts, but it does take practice to get used to actually writing them. Let's try one more example. As a LinkedIn user, I want to search for jobs that are remote only, so that I can apply to jobs that allows me to work from anywhere. The acceptance criteria can be something like this. Given I am under the job tab in LinkedIn, when I search for jobs, and I filter by remote only, then remote only jobs are displayed, and I can apply for them. So we wrote our user story and included an acceptance criteria. But how can we double check ourselves to make sure we wrote an overall good and effective user story? This is done with the help of the acronym INVEST. INVEST means independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. Let's take a look at independent. A story that is independent is not coupled to any other story. It can be developed in any order and can be released on its own. Negotiable means while the end goal may be clearly described for the user story, the methods by which that goal is achieved should be negotiable. Valuable means every story that's delivered should make your product more valuable. Estimatable, the user story has enough information for the team to size it, so they can probably plan and commit to that work. Small means the user story should be done within an iteration, or sprint. User stories are easier to estimate and test when they're smaller. Testable means stories should be testable in a binary way. That means they either pass or fail their associated tests. This means the user story has a good acceptance criteria. With that, we conclude this video on how to write good user stories in Agile. In this video, we will answer what are story points in Agile. Let's start with a definition of story points. Story points are a relative unit of measure used for estimating and planning work. Relative sizing is the practice of sizing things relative to each other rather than to an absolute unit of measure. It's like comparing animals to each other. For example, let's imagine we are comparing a chicken to a large dog, to a lion, to a bear, and to an elephant. It's pretty clear which one is bigger than the other, even if we don't know the exact weight or size of each one. In the Agile world, this means that if we have a story that is assigned 1 story point and another story assigned 2 points, the 2-point story should take twice more effort compared to the first one. In other videos, we will cover how to estimate using story points with the help of the Fibonacci scale, so make sure you subscribe to our channel and stay tuned to upcoming videos. In Agile, story points are used for estimating the overall effort that is required for work to be fully complete. The team needs to include everything that goes into that effort. That could be the amount of work, the complexity of work, the risk, and uncertainty. An example of low amount of work but high complexity would be the development of a complex business algorithm. The end result might not be large, but the effort required to develop might be. Examples of high amount of work but low complexity could be building additional section of a web page similar to the rest of an existing site, or adding a high amount of simple fields to an existing website. This work might not be complex, but it's still a high amount of work. The risk and uncertainty should be considered as well when you're estimating using story points. For example, if the stakeholders' requirements are unclear or the technology used for solving a problem hasn't been used before, this will introduce risk and uncertainty. Story points combine all these factors into one relative size measure. It's important for the development team to remember all these other factors outside of the amount of work when estimating. If user stories are higher in complexity, risk, or uncertainty, the story points should be higher in estimation. This is also based on the impact each has on the likely effort to complete the user story. This ends our video on what are story points in Agile. In this video, we'll talk about what Scrum metrics to implement as a new Scrum Master. If you just started as a Scrum Master or you just joined a new team and you're not sure what metrics you should start tracking for your team, this video is for you. In this video, we will cover 3 main Agile metrics you should implement right away for your teams. We will define each metric and discuss how to use them. The metrics we will cover today are velocity, capacity, and burndown charts. Let's start with velocity. By definition, velocity is the amount of work a team can complete within a given time period, usually a sprint. It is measured by adding the sizes of all the user stories that are completed by the end of the sprint. A user story is either done or not done. The business or product owner only receives value when a user story is fully complete. This is why velocity does not include the sizes of numbers of partially completed user stories. Velocity measures what was delivered and not the value of what was delivered. Velocity is a popular metric used in many agile practices. Velocity is usually visualized as a bar graph, with the unit of measure on the vertical axis and the sprints on the horizontal axis. Velocity is tracked in the same unit the team uses to plan the work. The most common unit of estimation in Agile are the story points. If you're not familiar with the story points, check out the other video we created on story points. You should see it in the top right side of your screen. Velocity usually varies the most in the first few sprints and then begins to stabilize. It's less predictable during the early iterations since the team needs some time to test their approach, methods, and familiarize themselves with the project. Velocity is essential for sprint planning and release planning. Once a team has tracked their velocity over multiple sprints, they can use their velocity to estimate when the next releasable milestone or project will be done. Let's look at some examples on how velocity can be used for sprint planning and release planning. Let's say all your user stories are estimated in story points. Your team started the sprint with 10 user stories, and all user stories are different sizes, as shown right here. The total of user stories add up to 31 story points. You just finished your sprint, and 9 out of 10 user stories were complete. The user story that was not complete has an estimated value of 5 story points. Your velocity for this sprint is 26 story points. That is because we had to subtract the entire 5 story points from your total of 31. As mentioned earlier, only the fully done user stories are counted towards your velocity without any partial completed user stories. So now we know your sprint 1 velocity is 26 story points. This information is critical for planning future sprints. Now let's say you continue to track your velocity for future sprints, and sprint 2 is 33 story points, sprint 3 is 28, sprint 4 is 29, and sprint 5 is 29 story points again. This information comes in handy when trying to predict releases. So now let's take a look on how we can answer questions like how many sprints will it take to deliver a milestone, or when will this be done? For predicting releases, velocity is most useful when expressed in a range. With the help of our data from the 5 sprints, we now know our range is 26 to 33 story points. Using a range allows us to be accurate without being overly precise. Now that we know our velocity range, let's look at an example of predicting the release. Let's say our product owner communicates to us the next milestone, and the product release needs to include 5 features. After estimation, feature A is 13 story points, feature B is 34 story points, feature C is 21 story points, D is 21 story points, and E is 13. That comes up to a total of 102 story points. With our lowest velocity of 26, it will take us 4 sprints, and with our highest velocity of 33 story points, it will take us about 3 sprints. With the information we know up to this point, our answer to the product owner is that it will take us 3 to 4 sprints to release all the 5 features. By using a range, we can communicate our uncertainty. Now you see why velocity is a must-have metric that every Scrum Master needs to track for their Scrum teams. Now let's look at capacity. By definition, capacity is an estimate of the total amount of Scrum team time available for a given sprint. One of the first activities during the sprint planning is determining the available capacity for the team. Knowing the capacity allows the Scrum team to know what they can deliver that sprint. Let's say your team is doing a 2-week sprint. We should acknowledge that not all 10 business days will be dedicated towards the active sprint execution. There are a lot of factors that impact the team's capacity and takes away time from the teams completing user stories that we need to take into that consideration. Let's take a look of what are those other factors. There are the sprint activities like sprint planning, sprint review, sprint retrospective, and backlog refinements. Usually, there are other enterprise activities outside of the sprint. They will still require your team's time. We should reserve some buffer time against things not going quite as planned. Plus, consider the personal time off for each Scrum team member. These are the biggest activities that occur during the active sprint. Assuming the team is using story points as their estimation method, determining capacity is the same as predicting our team's target velocity for the upcoming sprints. To make this determination, start with the first sprint velocity, which in our case is 26 story points. If you have velocity data from multiple sprints, use the velocity range. In our case, if we average out the velocity for all the 5 sprints, our velocity average comes up to 29 story points. You want to consider if the new sprint will be different from a previous sprint. If your new sprint doesn't have big changes in the factors mentioned earlier, you can use your last sprint or sprint average velocity as your capacity. If the future sprint is different from your last sprint, for example, maybe there's a big holiday like Christmas and New Year's. Let's say that leaves us with 1 week out of the 2-week sprint. In this case, our capacity should be adjusted to half the story points. The idea here is to adjust the capacity in story points for the future sprints based on how the factor discussed change from sprint to sprint. Keep in mind the adjustment doesn't need to be perfect. Keep it high level and don't try to over-engineer. Every sprint you adjust based on your lessons learned. Now, let's look at the burndown charts and how they're used. A burndown chart is a graphical representation of the work that's left to do versus the time left. It can be used to show the work needed to be done for a project or an active sprint. This metric is popular in Scrum and is used by most teams to track their progress during the active sprint. A typical burndown chart shows the estimated effort in time or user stories on the vertical axis and the time in days on the horizontal axis. The burndown chart will display an ideal progress line and an actual progress line. As work is completed, the actual progress, also called the estimated work remaining line, on the chart will move downward, reflecting the smaller amount of work that still needs to be done. Let's use our sprint 1 example from earlier. If we start our 2-week sprint with 26 story points, the vertical axis will show the story points with the top displaying 26. The horizontal axis will show the sprint days, in our case 2 weeks, which are 10 business days. Once the sprint starts, every day that goes by, the burndown red line moves to the right. Assuming our user stories are estimated in story points, the story point value that a user is given or assigned, when the story is completed, the burndown chart will go down by the same value. If a 2 story point user story is complete from our sprint, our burndown line will go down by 2 story points, and the remaining user stories should show 24 user stories on the left side of the chart. A burndown chart can also go up, which usually is not a good thing. This happens if a user story is inserted into the sprint after the sprint has already started. For example, if we insert a 5 story point in the sprint, the burndown line will go up by the same number, and the story points remaining should show now 31. This means our scope has increased for our sprint. The velocity, capacity, and burndown charts are 3 core metrics that every Scrum Master should use with their teams. In summary, the velocity allows the Scrum Master to plan and forecast product releases and milestone delivery. The capacity allows the Scrum Master to identify how much scope the Scrum team should sign up for every sprint during the sprint planning meeting. And finally, the burndown chart shows the progress and work left for an active sprint or project. The velocity, capacity, and burndown charts are 3 core metrics that every Scrum Master should use with their teams. Thank you for watching.